The unprecedented pace of disruption and uncertainty makes leadership more relevant today than ever before. It's not position or power, but your leadership skills that help you to think in unique, creative ways. When faced with a crisis, a leader is forced to think and make critical decisions. A leader who empowers a team and gives the employees accountability increases the effectiveness of an organization. John Maxwell says that leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. Warren Bennis says leadership is the capacity to turn vision into reality. And Bill Gates says, as we look ahead into the next century, leaders will be those who empower others. Today, it's my honor to welcome on the show, Kiron Bondale. Kiron, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Kiron Bondale, PMP, PMI, ACP, PSM2, ICP, ACC, RMI, PMI, RMP, DLSM, CDAI, is a senior consultant for World Class Productivity Incorporated, delivering training and consulting services to North American clients. Kiron has managed hundreds of projects in both internal and third-party contexts over the past 20 years. He has set up and led project management offices and has provided agile project portfolio management and project management consulting services to hundreds of clients across multiple industries. Kiron is an active member of the Project Management Institute and served as a volunteer director on the board of the PMI Lakeshore chapter for 6 years. He has reviewed a number of recent PMI standards and practice guides, including the 6th and 7th editions of the PMBOK guide. Kiron has been published in both project management specific journals as well as industry specific journals. He has delivered hundreds of webinar presentations on a variety of project management and agile topics and has presented at multiple industry conferences. In addition to this weekly blog, Kiron is a daily contributor to key LinkedIn and projectmanagement.com project management discussion groups. Kiron is a firm believer that a pragmatic approach to organization change that addresses process and technology, but primarily people, will maximize chances for success. Thank you again, Kiron, for attending this interview.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Let me begin by asking you, what do you think are the 3 important traits that a project manager or a leader should have to thrive in a disruptive economy?
Absolutely. I mean, I'd say the top 3 that come to mind are personal resilience, the ability to roll with the punches, whether things are going better than we expected, worse than expected, completely changing the approach that we might take for our projects. We need to demonstrate resilience to model that for our stakeholders. The second, I would say, is they need to have a high focus on people, servant leadership, empathy for their people. Because when things are changing, when we're facing disruptions or there is a chaotic situation, it's how we treat the people that is going to lead to success, not just following processes or using certain tools. And the third and final trait I would mention is they commit themselves to continuous learning. Things are always changing, and a project manager that doesn't keep themselves abreast of what's happening, whether that be from a hard skill, soft skill, or a business domain perspective, they're going to be left behind in the dust.
Very interesting points: resilience, servant leadership, and being tuned to abreast to the latest technologies here. Which brings me to the second question, which is on crisis response. How do you think a leader responds to a crisis, and what are the important parts of his effective crisis response?
I'd say the most important one is communications. As a project manager, as a project leader, we learn that 95% of what we do is communications. That becomes even more important during a crisis, because during a crisis, people don't necessarily all have the same information. There's a lot of disinformation, there's a lot of myths and rumors, and if left unchecked, that sort of issue or that sort of kind of miscommunication can result in a lot of issues. It can cause a crisis that could have been maybe mitigated fairly early on to spiral out of control. So a good leader always has effective communications. And if they see that there is some misinterpretation or miscommunication happening, they take a proactive stance to address that. I think it's also important that a leader is able to reflect vulnerability. We don't need leaders to be heroes. They shouldn't be artificially saying, hey, I can deal with any situation that comes my way. Don't worry, everything's great. Because that comes across as being unauthentic or fake. And the moment we do that, we lose the credibility of the team members and the stakeholders that we work with. So we need to be able to express vulnerability, saying things like, I don't actually know what's going to happen, but let's take it one day at a time. Let's plan the day, let's work that plan, and then let's see what tomorrow brings. That shows greater authenticity than a leader that says, no, I think we can predict what's going to happen a month out, 2 months out, 3 months out with certainty, and let's execute to that. So I think showing that vulnerability and being authentic is extremely important. But I think it's also important during a crisis that a leader demonstrate discipline. It can be tempting during a crisis to just move into ad hoc, reactive type behavior. A good leader is the one that can take the time to pause, collect themselves, define a plan, no matter how simple that plan is, maybe only for the next hour, and execute that plan. And I think there's a famous saying, forget who it is, but it is that when everyone around you is losing their head, if you can remain calm, you will be the leader of the world.
Nice points there. Then comes to leadership and the team. How do you keep your team motivated and connected during a crisis? And what type of support can give your employees during this time?
Absolutely. So I don't believe it's a case of doing something different or doing something in addition to what you've done before. I think it's a question of spending more effort on what you should already be doing. So let's start off with something very simple, which is servant leadership and demonstrating empathy. It's important that we continue to do that, but we take it up a notch, because when people are feeling uncertain, when maybe they've experienced personal loss, we need to act with greater levels of empathy than we might have otherwise. Then coupling with that, to help the team find their internal motivation, I always go to Daniel Pink and his book Drive. It's the same 3 levers that we need to focus on. Autonomy. Even when things are in a crisis situation, find a way for people to feel somewhat in control of the work they're doing. Mastery. If we think of chaos or crises as opportunities, they can be a great opportunity to learn. Can we give people an opportunity to increase their mastery of their craft? And the final one is purpose. Well, in a crisis, purpose is almost given to us on a silver platter. We want to find our way out of the crisis. That should be a unifying purpose for everybody on the team. So when we have autonomy, mastery, purpose, we demonstrate servant leadership, and we don't forget about recognizing people. Just because there's a crisis doesn't mean people do not expect to be recognized. We need to continue to do that. If we take those 5 elements and we combine them, we should help to unleash the intrinsic motivation of our team.
If you look back at your career, what do you think is one of the biggest challenges that you have faced as a project manager or a leader?
Certainly, one of the biggest challenges that I've faced has been unpredictable availability of the human resources, the people that would be available to work on my projects. It's bad enough when we're dealing with uncertainty around scope, or when there's uncertainty around a solution approach, or when timelines are tight or budgets are tight. But then if you come to me and say, I cannot actually commit to providing you with a certain team up to a certain percentage level and commit to that day over day, week over week, then how do you expect me to be able to forecast what I'm able to deliver? I can promise you that we will deliver something. What I cannot promise is a specific scope expectation within a certain budget by a certain time. And unfortunately, too often, commitments are being made and handed to project leaders without providing them with predictable allocation of team members to deliver that scope. That's one of the biggest challenges I faced.
There has been a big shift from face-to-face meetings and co-location to a virtual setting with a lot of tools, Zoom, Skype, you name it. And it's the norm nowadays to speak with people online, to get interviewed online, and to start work online or from home. So how do you lead effectively in such a virtual workplace?
I would, similar to the question around leading during a crisis, I don't think it's a question of doing something necessarily different. It's focusing more on doing what we should have been doing anyway. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. We all learned that it's a good idea to help our team discover their ground rules, their working agreements early in the life of a project. That defines the rules of engagement for how we will work together. But that's more important when we operate in a virtual manner, because we don't have the full depth of understanding that comes with reading body language, hearing the tone, seeing facial expressions that we would if we were working in a co-located manner. And so it's that much more important that we have those rules that we define to say, if I don't quite understand what you're saying, or if I think that you might have said something which offends me, how are we going to work through that without jumping to some conclusion that might be false? Another example might be active listening. We need to be active listening regardless of whether we are working face-to-face or separated over a phone call or over a video conference. But when we lose that in-person presence, it's more important to be active listening. We need to put away the devices, turn off sources of distraction, and focus on the conversation. So it's not a question of doing something different. It's a question of focusing more on what we should have been doing all along.
At the beginning of this year, many companies were taken by surprise when this COVID-19 pandemic struck. So how do we preempt such a risk and factor it to our project management plans?
That's a really great question, Sajeev. It would be wonderful if project managers were fortune tellers, or they could predict the future. We don't have the ability to do that. And there's many people that would look at COVID-19 and say that this was a black swan. If we look at what Nassim Taleb says, they would call it a black swan. I don't necessarily agree, because there's been many reports about the dangers of an animal-based virus escaping for the last 15, 20 years. So it was more a question of when, not if. So I like to think of it as being a known unknown, but one that had very low likelihood. In the same way as if we were to say, how do we protect our projects if an asteroid was to hit the Earth? Well, it's not an unknown unknown, because one could say that an asteroid has hit the Earth before, so it's logical to assume it will happen again, but it is of such low a likelihood that we don't factor it into our risk plans. The only defense we have against it is that when we plan our projects and we have our constraints defined, we need to ask ourselves the question, what happens if one of the prerequisites driving these constraints becomes unavailable? In other words, treat everything as an assumption and be willing to say, if that assumption is proven wrong, how do we react to it? If we at least put the time to think through that, then we won't be caught in a surprise fashion when something emerges that we were not expecting. It's the difference between an active acceptance strategy and a passive acceptance strategy. In both cases, we are accepting the risk because we believe it's low probability. But the active response strategy would say, well, let's at least think through what might we do if.
What do you see as the future for project managers?
I think it's a very bright future. Project management is the critical discipline required to deliver change. Change happens through projects. PMI has done a great job of marketing this concept of the project economy. That's the world we live in. But project managers and kids that are new to the profession, getting into the profession, shouldn't sit back on their laurels and think it's going to be an easy ride. No, with globalization, with access to talent anywhere in the world, and certainly with COVID-19 proving that you can manage projects from anywhere in the world, the need for project managers to prove their ability to deliver across the three legs of the talent triangle, demonstrating hard skills, soft skills, and business acumen, is more and more important. And so what that means is that while there might be a lot of great opportunities for project managers, the demand for top-notch talent project managers is where it will be. They need to prove that they can meet that demand.
Which brings me to my final question. Do you have any words of advice for youngsters, the millennials who wish to take up a career in project management or leadership?
Absolutely. I think for a lot of people looking at the profession from the outside in, they see the technical side of project management. They see the hard skills, building a schedule, managing a budget, putting together a risk register. Those skills and those techniques are important. Those practices are important. It isn't a good idea to try to manage projects without a grounding in that knowledge. But what you want to do if you're entering the profession is focus on people first. Always focus on effective communications, interpersonal relations, building good relationships with your stakeholders, managing in a fair fashion, active listening, dealing with empathy, not being afraid to deal with conflict. It's the people side of the profession where the focus should be for anyone entering the profession.
Thank you, Kiran, for sharing those wisdom and insights on so many questions that I had prepared for you. And it was a pleasure speaking to you on leadership in a crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sajid, for the opportunity.